calhar nós vamos dar início para não prejudicar os que chegaram a tempo, em nome dos que estão atrasados. Antes de mais nada, boa tarde, bem-vindos mais uma vez a esta série de Conversas com História. É um prazer ter-vos aqui. O meu nome é Raquel Varela, eu sou historiadora e professora universitária de História do Trabalho hoje tenho comigo um convidado especial, o professor Peyman Jafari. Nós conhecemos-nos em Amsterdão, onde trabalhámos juntos no Instituto Internacional de História Social e, portanto, é para mim um prazer redobrado, porque não só tenho um colega, como um amigo hoje aqui. Este convite deve-se sobretudo ao facto do professor Peyman ter se centrado na história da Revolução Iraniana, que se celebra este ano os 40 anos, e nós queremos perceber um bocadinho qual é a história dessa revolução e também queremos perceber um bocadinho o que é hoje a conjuntura do Médio Oriente e como é que nós compreendemos fenómenos como o fundamentalismo islâmico ou a ascensão da extrema-direita na Europa. Quero também acrescentar que o professor Peyman é professor na Universidade de Amsterdão, onde vive e está naturalizado, e foi agora convidado para ir para Princeton, nos Estados Unidos, e é obviamente eu quero lhe dar os parabéns por isso. Peyman, thank you so much for coming to Portugal and share this knowledge with us for this hour. I would like to start to ask you about the Iranian Revolution. We have, this year we celebrate the 40th anniversary of the revolution. Can you tell us a little bit, how was the regime before the revolution? What happened in that revolution? Imagine that we know nothing about the subject. And try to teach us a little bit, because it's a major event in the 20th century world history.
Well, as you say, the revolution was very important in world history. It's called the last major revolution of the 20th century, because it was also the most popular revolution. Can you hear me?
You can't hear it? Não se ouve?
Can you hear me? Yeah. So it was the most popular revolution, 11% of the population taking actively part in the demonstrations, protests, and so on. But as you know, revolutions don't just happen. There must have been problems, issues in society. And I don't want to go too much back, but I think it is important to say something about 1953, because that's the moment that in Iran, there was Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. He nationalized the oil industry because that was in the hands of the British. Well, the British didn't like it, of course. And this was also the moment that on the global scene, the US was replacing Britain as a global power. So the British went to the US and they begged them, like, can you help us to get rid of this Mossadegh? And they did. So they organized the coup d'etat and toppled this prime minister. Why is this important? Because it is important for two reasons. First of all, because it created lots of resentment against the US. Because there was this popular movement going on. Nationalization of oil was very important. So this is the foreign aspect. Domestically, it was also very important. Because it really undermined the democratization process in Iran. This was something that was coming from below, so the population was taking part in it. And by doing this, they actually turned the clock back in the democratization process. So after that, after 1953, the regime of the Shah, the Pahlavi monarchy, lacked legitimacy in the eyes of most Iranians. And also, the Shah was getting lots of weapons from the US because Iran was functioning as the policeman in the region. So he built, with the support of the US and also Israel, a secret service that was repressing the opposition. And again, this is very important. And you have to interrupt me if I'm talking too long.
No, no, no.
Okay. But why is this also internally important? Because the Shah repressed the secular forces of nationalists, but also the communists and the left in general. So those secular forces were weakened in the 25 years from 1953 into the 1970s. What remained were the mosques as places to mobilize. So lots of people were seeing the Shah not really as somebody legitimate. We're seeing him as somebody put in place by the US. And also then in the 1970s, lots of oil money came into the country because the oil prices went up in 1973. This was this global crisis because of the Arab-Israeli war. So lots of money came in, but it was not distributed equally. So inequality actually grew. So expectations of people were growing, but they were thinking, okay, but we are not going forward as much as we would like to, because in some points there was advancement.
So how the revolution started?
Well, then we really moved to 1978. Protests start to mobilize, small protests. For instance, in 1970, in the summer, the poor people in Tehran, in the shanty towns, went on protest, and they were repressed. But in January 1978, this was the most important moment, because the Shah was feeling what is happening, so he ordered somebody to write a newspaper article in which he attacked Ayatollah Khomeini, who became later the leader. But he wasn't that much known. So by attacking him, and he said this is a conspiracy, the black and red conspiracy of the communists and the Muslims. And of course, lots of people were mad about this. So they took to the street, the supporters of Khomeini, still a small group, but the troops of the Shah shot at them. And people died. In Islamic tradition, you commemorate the dead every 40 days. So 40 days later, there was commemoration of these dead people. You guess what happened? The troops of the Shah killed again many people. So we got every 40 days, you had
A massacre.
Massacre, and then growing demonstrations because people were becoming more and more mad. So this grew until the summer of 1978. And then people were thinking, maybe we should do something else because when we go to the street, we die. And then the strikes started.
Where did the strike started?
They started in many places, but most importantly in the oil industry that I have been studying myself. So in September 1978, and this came actually on the day that became known as Black Friday, because on that Friday, lots of people were killed in a demonstration. And then the Tehran refinery workers went on strike. And from there, the strike spread to the oil fields in the south of Iran, and then other places in Iran. And then also in other factories, in the iron, steel factories, in the car industry, strikes really, and strike committees were being organized. And this was the winter of 1978, yeah? And this was very important because oil was very important to the Shah. All the money of the economy was coming from it. So
the industry was paralyzed?
The industry was paralyzed, the state was paralyzed, and the Shah was still keeping on to power. And the American embassy at that time, if you read their records, they were saying, nothing will happen, this is just demonstrations.
They did the same here with our revolution. They say everything is okay
course,
there, and they were already taking the
Yeah.
power, the MFIA.
Yeah, that's...
They have no such good secret service as
No.
they think.
they spend lots of money on it, but... and that's also the nature of revolutions, to be honest. I mean,
Yes.
revolutions are not to be predicted. At one point, it really starts the momentum. So I would say by November, December, the demonstrations were huge. And 2nd of December, a general strike was organized across Iran, also in the oil industry. And that was really the start of the fall of the regime.
This general strike, when you say it was organized by a union, by the mosques, by the oil industry, who has organized?
Just ordinary workers were in there. They had organized their strike committees, But of course, the fight about the leadership of the movement already started because Khomeini, he was in Paris, by the way, he was exiled. From there, he was trying to lead what is happening. So he was trying to order these strikes. But of course, people were doing what they want to do, and he was trying to also lead the strikes and the protests. And lots of people, to be honest, were looking at him. But you know why? Because we often think that Iranians are Muslim, okay, which is true. And he was, of course, a Muslim leader, a cleric. And that had an impact, because he was also using the language of the left, because he was trying to incorporate, as I said, the left and the nationalists had been repressed. But he was trying to integrate their words into his mobilization. So he was talking about anti-imperialism, of cutting the hand of the US. That was always something that the nationalists had said. And he was also saying, this has to be the revolution of the downtrodden. So he was saying, I am for the for the Islam of the poor, not of the Islam of the rich. So he was really also trying to mobilize the poor through this kind of language. But most importantly, he was a strong man. He was not a man of concessions. So you had most liberal politicians, they were making concessions to the Shah. Khomeini was saying, no, 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 no. We are going on with the revolution. And there was a revolution. People were being killed on the street. So people were really looking up to him of, you know, this man can lead Iran to somewhere. So at that point, he had lots of charisma. And people didn't know what he was really promising. He was just saying, let's get rid of the Shah. And then everybody was kind of in that mood.
But Peyman, I have to make some provocative question now, because we keep hearing, especially about revolutions in undeveloped countries like Iran or recently the Arab Spring, that when there are revolutions in undeveloped countries, the risk of a very reactionary counter-revolution is too high. Mm-hmm. What do you think about this?
I don't believe it. And this is why it started in 1953. Because actually you see that in the history of the countries of the Middle East, also undeveloped countries, there have been many moments for development within these countries. And by actually repressing and closing off those moments of possibility, you get reactionary politics. This is what happened. I mean, if you go back to the 20th century of Iran, Iran had the first modern revolution of the Middle East in 1906. They created a parliament. That's why it was called constitutional revolution, to limit the power of the king. At that time, the British and the Russians intervened to foreclose it. And then we had this again in 1953. So if you don't give it a chance, it will actually lead to more reactionary politics. And of course, there is always the danger, but there is also possibility for other forces. Even if you look to the outcome of this current revolution, I mean, this regime, to be honest, sometimes people have to go through their own experience. Mm-hmm. At that time, Khomeini was saying, you know, Islam is the solution for everything. So
it is clear now, sorry to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
It is clear now for the Iranian people that Islam is not a solution?
No.
Do you think they've done this experience?
Yes, yes. And even more, because I would say even, because we are also talking always about, when talking about undeveloped countries and Islamic countries, about modernity. Are they modern or not modern? But we have to realize that every country takes a different road to modernity, of what it means to become modern. It's not one road. And this is the paradox of the Iranian Revolution. Because after the revolution, what Khomeini did is give lots of power to the clerics of the Islamic clergy, yeah? But of course, what do you do if you have the clerics dealing with the society, with economics? Suddenly, you have to deal with inflation. Suddenly, you have to deal with building roads. You have to, with pollution, with everything. And these are worldly things. These are not something metaphysical. These are worldly things. this is actually secularization, if you think of it. Because, and this happened, by the way, in the late 1980s, because there was lots of conflict in Iran between these clerics that were a bit more progressive and those who were conservative. So at one point, the fight was so hard that Khomeini had to intervene. And he gave this example of, okay, listen, if the state wants to build a road, and there is a mosque in front of it, what has to be done? And you know, a mosque is a very holy place, no? He said, well, now we have an Islamic state. If it is in the interests of the Islamic State to build a road, well, then you have to destroy the mosque and build the road. Do you understand what I mean? That in a strange way, this is the other route to secularization. So because what Khomeini wanted to do was Islamize politics, yeah? But I would say the other thing happened. Islam was politicized. And by politicizing Islam, in a strange way, you also open it up to earthly questions. And then debates start to develop.
Some of them are nowadays key debates. What is the role of the Iran in the region at this moment and in the international environment of states, of course?
We will come to internal, but then let's start with the regional. Because after the revolution, again, one of the slogans, all revolutions have this, by the way, exporting the revolution. You know, you have had this revolution inside, so you want to spread it to the other countries. So this was the logic in the early years. But this finished within 1 year because Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. And he did it because he thought he has also the green light of the US. You know, because the US lost their main supporter, the Shah. So in that war, every Arab country supported Saddam Hussein, like Saudi Arabia, all other countries. With one exception, Syria did not support them, and Syria supported Iran. And this also explains why Iran and Syria are now very much together. So Iran, after the Iraq-Iran war, started a more pragmatic foreign policy. And Iran has, I would say, a combination of this very ideological foreign policy and very pragmatic foreign policy. I will give you an example, because if you listen to the media, it's, I think, always very simplistic. They say, well, you can understand the conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia because this is a war between Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims. Saudi Arabia being Sunni, Iran being Shia.
This is how it's told here all the time by the media as well.
Because it makes it simple, then we understand. I have to disappoint you, this is not true.
It's not simple.
It's not simple. I can give you just a few examples to make you understand. So Iran also supports the Palestinian resistance, yeah? They are Sunni. In northern Iran, you have the republics of Armenia and Azerbaijan, ex-Soviet republics. Armenia is a Christian republic. Azerbaijan is a Shia republic. With whom do you think Iran has the best ties? With Armenia. They're very much friends because of geopolitical positions, not because of religion. So geopolitics is very important. And why is geopolitics very important? Because Iran, after the revolution, feels under pressure that the US has always wanted to topple the regime with sanctions and so on. And they feel encircled because after the Afghanistan invasion, 2001, and Iraq war, 2003, there are military bases in those countries, and there are military bases in the Persian Gulf. So the Iranian military is very much obsessed with the danger of an American invasion of Iran. And that danger, of course, has become even more in the last year because the nuclear deal between Iran and the US was signed in 2015 with Iran and Obama. But when Trump got elected, he said, I'm going to get rid of the nuclear deal. And he did so last May. And since then, he has reimposed economic sanctions on Iran. And that has really worsened the situation.
And how do you think it will develop? Do you foresee a war? Do you foresee a change inside Iran?
Well, first, the foreign politics, it's very difficult to predict. Otherwise, I would become very rich. I could buy shares and so on. But it's very difficult. Look, I don't think anybody wants war. Also the US not, because they had one war in Iraq, and we know what happened. It was a disaster for them, and they have still not, come on top of it. So they don't want a war. Iran doesn't want a war. But the problem is they are building up the tension. And when tension builds up, something can happen and can go out of control. Because they have these military bases, the US, for instance, in Iraq, and Iranians have their military personnel there as well. So a conflict could emerge there. The Iranians, I think, are waiting for Trump to go. The elections in the US are in 2020. So we have to wait what happens then. Because if Trump doesn't go and he stays, I think in Iran, then they will have no patience. For instance, they will also leave the nuclear deal. Well, and if they leave the nuclear deal, more tension will build up.
Peyman, let me go back now to something you have told at the beginning of our talk. The idea that history is not always progress. We can go and being on the wrong direction, although we are moving forward. We have this idea very strong about Iran, because when we come to know the Persian culture, how it has developed in history, in poetry, in writing, in painting, in and now I think in fact I have two questions for you. One is that in the media there is always the idea that these Islamic republics are totally, they have smashed all cultural, which it seems not true at all. But on the other way, it's true that probably some of the best intellectuals have left the country. Could you develop a little bit this?
This is also, again, one of those complicated and painful histories, because, and where we should also avoid simplicity. Because even if you look to what happened after the revolution on the top, so really the Islamists, they didn't have one policy. You have really the conservatives who are against women singing. It's not allowed in Iran when women sing alone, unfortunately.
I know, because I went to Gulbenkian to see two women from Iran. And they, but they are part of a group of resistance in Iran, and the action is to sing. It's fantastic. Their action is not a strike or a demonstration; is to sing in public.
That's also resistance.
Yes.
So that's, but so some of the conservative clerics, this is their policy. But there are also others who are opposed against this. But more important is the society, as you say, because some people, most Iranians see themselves as Muslim. And this has also changed in the last 40 years, because, look, during the time of the Shah, if you were a believer, you were marginalized. So you could, on national TV, you couldn't see women with a headscarf. Like most Iranians were using headscarf, but you cannot see this on TV. So they felt really marginalized. Unfortunately, after 1979, this has switched. And now the religious are repressing the seculars. And this is, of course, the mistake, that we cannot do this. If you do this, you will marginalize people, and it will come back. But I would also say that the Iranian population, with all its differences, being Muslim and all shades of Muslim. Some people go to the mosque, some people don't go. They just believe. Like you have it here, like you have really different degrees. But culture has also thrived. I don't know if you have heard of Iranian cinema. in the last 40 years.
Kiarostami, we
Kiarostami,
can see it
yeah.
here. I don't know if
Yeah.
much
Or
more than this.
Farhadi, Asghar Farhadi, his last movie he made in Spain. I forgot its name in Spanish, but he's a very, very famous filmmaker. So Iranian cinema has actually thrived in the last 40 years. So that's also a paradox. Because they, of course, try to limit it. There is censorship on the Iranian cinema. But people find ways around censorship, and then they actually make something very beautiful.
You have mentioned the scarf, the chador, and I have seen several demonstrations in Iran of women, including one type of resistance, which is to take it out in the middle of the streets. At the same time, we are, not we, but parts of the left or the democratic sectors in Europe are fighting for the right, for example, in France, of women to use the chador against the French state, the republicanism in France, that wants to forbid it.
Yeah.
How we can say it's an act of tolerance to use the scarf that is repressed, that is obliged in Iran. So the same, and I have to quote a journalist in France recently. She's from Iran, and she wrote "Why I'm Not a Feminist," a quite important article, saying one of the reasons is that I see the left here saying it's an act of freedom to use this. But freedom is not just a question of liberal choice. Freedom is about culture, is about what are you pressed to do. How you see all these contradictions?
Well, that's a very important debate everywhere in Europe. I don't know how it is here in Portugal, but definitely very much in the Netherlands. It's a big debate, and of course in France, very,
I suppose
very big
because
debate.
the Muslim communities there are bigger than in Portugal.
But I would say it's actually very possible to do both things. Defend the right of the Iranian women in Iran not to wear the hijab, which I very much support, and also defend the right of Muslim women to wear it here, because it is about free choice. I think that should be the issue. Wherever it is imposed on women, you get into trouble. So let me give you actually the example of Iran. This was tried in the 1930s when the father of the last Shah became Shah through a coup d'etat. He introduced a law banning the chador. What happened, because the majority of women were wearing the chador, so they stayed home. So women were actually pushed out of the public space. So first of all, it was bad for women because they could not come out and participate in the public space. But second of all, people in Iran started to think, so modernization is equal to repressing our Muslim identity. And of course, later in 1979, this came back as a blowback with the rise of Islamism, of political Islam. So it is also counterproductive, I would say. In the West, the same. And by the way, let me also give you the example of the Iranian Revolution. So the Iranian Revolution, afterwards, secular women were repressed. I mean, women could not become judge, for instance. Lots of Iranian intellectual women had to leave the country. That's absolutely terrible. And I condemn it. We all have to condemn it, I think. But this is the complexity. But for the majority of the Iranian women, it became also possible to participate in society. Let me give you an example why. So if you were a traditional family in one of the provinces in Iran, you wanted to send your child to university in Tehran. When there is this traditional family, you don't do it because sending a young woman to study in Tehran, you don't do it because you don't know what will happen and so on. But under the Islamic Republic, where everybody is wearing the chador and in the public space it is much easier, these fathers allowed their kids to go actually to Tehran and to study. But you know then what happened? These women went to university. They started studying. They mingled with men, with others, and in a big city. And lots of those women developed and took off the chador themselves because they went through this experience. So there is no way of, forcing people to do this or to do that.
But let me develop this a little bit. My argument is, in one way, we have the state, the French state or the Islamic state imposing a way of dressing. That's a state attitude that uses the force and the monopoly of violence in the limits. That's it. But on the other way, you have what is called the civil society. I don't like very much this concept, but let's say associations or parties or out of the state. Shouldn't these progressive sectors out of the state, although they are against any kind of imposition, fighting the fundamentalism and fighting for the idea that women don't have to cover their head to become free people. So the difference is between how the left or the progressive forces or the democratic sectors, because right-wing democratic sectors defend this as well.
But if we are clear that at least we are opposed against states imposing whatever, like wearing or not wearing on people. So if we agree on that, then we can move to what is our own attitude to it. Also there, I think you have to take into mind the political context very much and the social context. Because, as you said, it is not only state imposition, it is also cultural, of course. But the question is, where do you put the limit? We know, of course, it can be culturally if you are raised in a Christian family, for instance, of not becoming gay, because it is more difficult in a very Christian family to say that you are gay. So there is really limits there. Also, growing up in a family with a headscarf, it will be more difficult. So what I think progressives have to do is make it easier for individuals who want to fight that war, if they want to be independent, to become gay or not wear the headscarf, to have the possibility to do this. So this is very, I think, important. But again, think of the limits, because if we are thinking of sexism, it's not only the headscarf, it is also lots of dress codes in the West are imposed on women, wearing the heel or wearing certain dresses, very sexualized. It can be a cultural imposition, role models. So what do we want to do? Do we want to have a public campaign against heels, against short skirts, and so on? I think we have to address sexism in the widest sense of, women's emancipation, but always with this sensitivity of the agency of the women themselves. Let me give you an example, because this is really complicated. Also in the West, if you have a Muslim woman, young Muslim woman, nowadays living in the Netherlands, look, there is lots of attacks on Muslims. Mosques are being attacked. There is politicians,
frequently
racists,
in the Netherlands nowadays.
Frequently, yes, dozens per year. Women walking on the streets, their headscarf being pulled from their head. So what you actually see is lots of these Muslim women becoming more Muslim, if you want, because they feel under attack. So they want to protect their identity because they feel isolated. So this is why I'm careful with this, about how the left and the progressives have to be, because it differs whether you are in Iran or whether you are here. I would say something else if I was in Iran, because the majority there is different.
But that will be my last question about this subject. If we are too careful or too paternalistic or even too relativistic, we may achieve a situation where the only ones defending laicism are the extreme right.
Yeah. No, I don't think so, because I think actually the progressives shouldn't be defensive about it. What we can say is indeed we are against imposition of these laws on people, okay? And then what we do is we are for equal rights for everybody. So we want in education, in healthcare, in cultural institutions, disregarding your religion, your ethnicity, and so on. If we do that, we protect also. So imagine if a woman comes to you in a school and says, well, my father is imposing the headscarf. We defend the student. And this is also, but again, imagine of this. If a kid comes to you in a school and you're a school teacher and says, I'm gay, I want to tell my parents I'm gay, and they don't accept this, what do you do? This is what I mean with careful, is not politically careful. It is about having cultural sensitivity. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes you can make issues actually worse. Mm-hmm. So if you say, but you are gay, just go to your family and say you are gay. But life is not that simple. Mm-hmm. What if that kid is, told, well, go away, we don't ostracized. So it makes it difficult. So you actually, if you really want to help them, mm-hmm. we have to create this cultural openness in which they can grow. And when there is this political pressure, this becomes actually politicized. Mm-hmm. So becoming a Muslim, fundamentalist even, becomes now, I have seen this happen in the Netherlands. 15 years ago, we didn't have so many women wearing the headscarf or a bear.
So do you think this was a reaction to the...
Yes, absolutely. I would say a reaction to the war on terror that happened. This really rhetoric of Muslims as the enemy. I saw that happen. Yes.
We are running out of time because I want to give the floor to our audience. Let me ask you just one last question before I give the floor to the audience. We see in a common sense saying that the Arab Spring had as the result the rising of the Islamic Brotherhood in Egypt, or the migration crisis in Libya, or the civil war in Syria. This was what happened. The Arab Spring is the consequence of this huge mess in the Middle East and Northern Africa. It's because of the Arab Spring?
No, I would say it is because of the defeat of the Arab Spring. Again, we have to be careful not to think, well, Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, is the same as Khomeini or other fundamentalist organizations. There are lots of differences between these organizations. Actually, the Muslim Brotherhood, if they were like Khomeini, this wouldn't have happened. They would have get in power and massacred everybody. But they came into parliament and they were really careful, and then the army made a coup d'etat against them. So what happened in Egypt is actually, I would describe it as counter-revolution. And this happened with all the basically Arab Spring movements. And there were two elements of this counter-revolution. One was the Egyptian army. And this is, by the way, the lesson of the Iranian Revolution for the Egyptian army and the Americans. Because during the Iranian Revolution, the army was sent into the street to fight the population. Therefore, lots of army people, after several months of fighting with people, they start to give up. This happened, of course, in the Portuguese Revolution as well. Now the Americans, and I have seen the documents, they really drew lessons of this. They said to the Egyptian army, no, you have to stay outside of this so you can come back at the crucial moment without dissolving. So this was one element, the army. And the other element was Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia actually poured money into Egypt also to support the army, but counter-revolution comes not only in the form of army, but also in actually Muslim fundamentalism, but not in the Muslim Brotherhood, because Saudi Arabia hates the Muslim Brotherhood, because you can think, they are all Muslim and both Sunni. No, Saudi Arabian kind of Wahhabism doesn't want any popular participation. But Muslim Brotherhood is political Islam, but they believe in parliament, in elections, not very democratic, but still elections and so on. Mm-hmm. But that goes too far for Saudi Arabia even. So what they did is they started funding all kind of Wahhabi, really conservative movements in Egypt. I'm talking about the Noor Party and others, which are really conservative. And this is what they did. And when in Bahrain there was demonstrations and revolution, Saudi Arabia sent tanks over the bridge to Bahrain to help crush the revolution. So actually what happened then is the defeat of the Arab Spring.
If it wasn't defeat, do you think Trump, Bolsonaro would have been elected?
Well, that's a big jump because there is always so many things in between. But in general, I think the world could have taken a more progressive turn. Because don't forget, this was not only happening in the Middle East. If you remember, the Square movement in Spain was happening at that time. And you know why it was called the Square movement? Because they copied it from Egypt. They copied it from Tahrir Square, where people occupied Tahrir. So what I want to say is that actually there is this alternative of people learning from each other, because the governments learn from each other. As I said, the Americans learned from the defeat in Iran, and they tried to do it in Egypt. But people can learn from each other as well, like how it is going. And there was this really mass movement against austerity in Europe, in the US. And I would say both the anti-austerity movement was defeated, of course, in Europe and the US. And the biggest reason it was defeated was because actually of using, I would say, racism. And there is this enemy, the Muslims, the refugees, etc. And in the Middle East, the same. It was defeated partly by saying, well, it is the Americans and so on. So really people have to learn from these lessons.
Thank you so much. I will give the floor to our guests now because we still have some minutes. Alguém quer fazer alguma questão? Podem fazer em português e eu traduzo, ou em inglês diretamente ao nosso convidado. Por favor.
I understand that the shadow scarf, as you call it, is this imposed by the government, or do women have the choice to do it or not doing it?
In Iran.
In Iran.
It is imposed. Yes.
Okay, that's
yes.
Quick answer. Another one. I understand the clergy runs the country. Is that right?
Complex.
So, in other words, they are the government.
They have huge power, let me say like that.
Will they ever surrender power to the politicians? We have just a democratic society like we have in the West?
You can develop
immediately answer?
Please,
yes,
we
okay.
have time.
Yes, look, what happened is this very complex system in Iran after the revolution. Because the clergy, Khomeini, of course he wanted to give himself and the clergy 100% of the power. But as I said, this was a revolution, so people had come onto the streets, so they had to make a concession to the people too. So therefore, they actually created elections, parliament, and president. So the system is very complex. You have the clergy, but you also have the politicians. So in the parliament after the revolution, more than 70% of the members of parliament were clergy. Now, only 16%, 1/6, are clergy. 1/6 in parliament, yeah? So actually what has happened is there is a whole bureaucratic layer of non-clerics in power. And also the army is important here, I would say, okay? Who are not clerics. But you are right that there is this conflict because the clerics don't want to give away power. But they are very old, really old. Ayatollah Khamenei is now 80 years old, and probably he has cancer. He's dying. All the people around him, his generation, have the same problem. So there is also a new generation wanting to come up, also among the politicians. So there is this fight going on between also the clerics and the lay politicians.
Mm-hmm. Was in power? Was he prime minister?
Yes. He was president, yeah.
But is he a politician or is one of the clergy?
He was cleric. He was cleric, yeah. Yeah, but he was one of these pragmatist clerics, if you want. He was president in the 1990s.
Do you still have anything to say?
Sorry, Rafsanjani?
Yeah. Does he have
He died. He died a few years ago. Yeah.
We still have time for 2 more questions, or maybe 3, 4. Please, there, and then we have...
Thank you. Good afternoon. Could you say that the regime has actually democratized its leadership style compared to 20 years ago? And given the opening of borders to the Western world, could we say that the people is like a little bit more living on a Western mode and a little bit more flexible? And what is the relationship between the people and the leadership nowadays in Iran?
Maybe we collect 2 or 3 questions. Yes, please.
There's been several changes that have gone on in the Middle East in leadership. And a lot of it has happened without too much sort of news or publicity about it. And the quality of the leadership coming in, and we, for example, look at Saudi Arabia, what's gone on there recently. Is there any need for concern because of the type of people that are coming into leadership in the different countries in the area?
Can you give to this, sir, please? Thank you.
Thank you for your explanations. I would like to know what's the opinion of the Iranian people towards Europeans. We know that they don't like USA. But what do they think about Europeans and mainly about the Spanish and the Portuguese? What are the opinion?
Yeah.
We have another 2 questions. Do you mind if we do it all, or you
Yeah,
prefer
I can
to answer?
do all.
Do you prefer to answer?
Yes, maybe these 3,
No,
and
please
then
answer,
we can
and
do.
then
Yes,
we make.
then we
Yes,
can go
please.
to. Yes, maybe starting with your question. It's very important because it is important to think of Iran not as static, but as something as changing. Even if change is limited, there is still lots of change going on. And the change comes through the action of the population themselves. Again, one example, I don't want to talk too much about the headscarf, but just one example, because you also asked this question. It was imposed after the revolution, 2 years, but it was fully imposed. But if you would go now to Iran, you see women wearing the headscarf until here, just like very relaxed here, very fashionable with eyeglasses, fancy and so on. But also you will find women with chador, and that's not imposed. So you have also really traditional women who choose to wear the full black chador. But majority of them not. Why not? Because actually women, day in, day out, went to the street, pushing the headscarf a little back, and the police arrested them. And then they did it the next day, and they did it the next day, and they did this with thousands. And the state thought, I give up. we cannot arrest all the women. So this is how the agency of people from within brings also change. But even if you would look to the political level, look, Iran is not a full democracy. There is a supreme leader, Khamenei, has lots of power. They can filter candidates for parliament, for presidency. So it limits the choice. But having said that, within the Middle Eastern context, the parliament has much more to say than, for instance, in Kuwait or Saudi Arabia, in which you don't even actually have a parliament. And there are lively debates between president and parliament because there are these elections. And you know how filters work? Filters are not perfect. So people always get through them, yeah? So there's this lively change going on. And if you would go to Iran, you will find all different, the youth in Iran has a very modern lifestyle. But modern, I mean mixing Iranian and Western. Because this is another thing I want to say about culture. Cultures are not homogenic. It's not just one culture. Iran has always been at the center of European culture, Islamic culture, and Persian culture, so pre-Islamic culture. And you will find 3 influences. And the mistake of the regime of the Shah was that it really denied the Islamic side of the culture. It said, no, we are just Western and Persian. And this contemporary regime makes the mistake by saying, no, we are only Islamic. It's not true. It's all European, Islamic, and Persian, and let people mix these things as they want themselves. So that's very important. Your question about leaderships. I mean, this is a very problematic issue in the Middle East, but I would say not only in the Middle East, globally, the type of leaders that are coming in place. We have had this whole flow of authoritarian populist leaders taking the stage, from the US to Russia to Saudi Arabia, and this is very dangerous. And we can, of course, think about why this is happening. We don't have the time to do it now, but it has something really, I think, to do with the deeper crisis of politics and the growing divide, actually, between people and the political systems. And then you find political systems that want to say, no, we are actually saying what the people think. But that's what I mean with populism, because it's more rhetoric than reality, because you want to bridge the gap with rhetorics than with real politics. And then we had, yes, the vision about Europe. By the way, Iranians are not anti-American in terms of anti-people, because if you, there's lots of tourism, by the way, now in Iran, has grown in the past 10, 15 years, especially from Europe, lots of people going. It's in the top 10 of alternative tourist places. So people in Iran would actually be very welcoming to also Americans and Europeans. Also with Portuguese, actually to Portuguese they would say we had one of the first encounters with the Portuguese in the 16th century when Portugal was going to the east and also went to the Persian Gulf, created a trade base in the Persian Gulf with the Safavid Empire at that time in Iran. There was also war, of course, because the Portuguese wanted a bit more than trade. So, but there's this long history, and people in Iran, even in the villages, are very curious to know what is happening, and they will be very nice to you because they hate what is happening in the media in Europe and the US, because they think Iran is given only this bad name of this evil place. So they are really actually very eager to talk to people.
Strange question. Do they know Ronaldo?
Oh, you bet they know. Yes, they love
That's
Ronaldo.
very famous everywhere.
Yeah, but now, of course, since Iran lost to Portugal, I was actually standing here last year when they lost, and I started trying not to be for Iran, because with all these Portuguese around me, that
we
had
have
changed everything.
2 more questions. This, sir, please.
My question was a little bit different. I want to just find out a little bit about Iran's relations with Turkey and because Turkey is now a major power in the region and a major conservative power, and how that relates to the Kurdish issue.
Yeah. Well, the Kurdish issue always complicates things, because it has always been an issue that can drive countries off each other or bring them together. So Iran and Turkey have always had a more normal relationship, not very close, but also not very bad. But in the last few years, when in 2011 the war in Syria started, the relationship between Iran and Turkey became very bad, from normal to very bad, because Turkey was supporting the opposition against Assad, Iran was supporting Assad. But then something changed, and that had, of course, to do with the Kurdish question. Then the Americans started to support the Kurds in Syria, and from that moment, Iran and Turkey started to become more friends. So I wouldn't say there is this very deep strategic alliance, and I don't see it happen. It's more tactical alliance of what is happening. Also with Russia, because now it is Turkey, Russia, Iran trying to order things in Syria. And the Kurds, by the way, have always been the victim of this, because the Americans, of course, supported the Kurds against Assad, but they dropped them as soon as they could when they wanted to become friends with the Turks. And they will do this every time again.
I have just one last question, please. Thank you.
So in the center of the conflict with the Western world in Iran, there are the nuclear weapons, and there are two theories around them. The first is that Iran wants to be energetically independent, so to develop a nuclear program, and at the same time they want to prevent the U.S. or their neighbors from invading through the U.S. because the U.S. doesn't invade countries with nuclear weapons. Could you comment on that?
Yes, that's very important because I think, first of all, Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. It has a nuclear energy program. But as you said, it could be for developing energy, but also to have the option, of course, of developing a nuclear bomb maybe in the future, but not as a real program to do, but as a negotiating card. Because Iran wants to basically be recognized as a regional power. After the Iranian Revolution, the US has always tried to kind of push Iran back. And Iran has 82 million population, as has a very one of the biggest economies in the region. So it wants actually this recognition. And they didn't want to give it to them. So with the nuclear program, it thought, now we can be part of the club. We can be part of the game. You can now negotiate with us. But the message coming from the US is, of course, very negative because now they are sanctioning Iran while Iran is actually committing itself to the nuclear deal. Just last week, the report of the International Atomic Agency came out, which says Iran is doing everything they promised because there are cameras hanging everywhere and so on. But the US is negotiating with Northern Korea that does have nuclear weapons. So some politicians in Iran could think now, well, if you have nuclear weapons, they will respect you and they will talk to you. But if you're not having nuclear weapons and then what you want to negotiate, they will not. So this will be actually even more counterproductive to some wanting to push Iran to get the nuclear weapons. But I think the major problem in the West-Iran clash has been, again, Iran has done negative stuff as well in the region. I don't want to diminish that role. But the major thing has been this not recognizing Iran as playing its role. Because I think if they would recognize it, and there would be a regional conference tomorrow, inviting Iran, inviting Saudi Arabia, inviting everybody to talk about how can we guarantee not peace, but less conflict. I think it would happen. But the US will not ever do this because it would recognize Iran. Since they lost the Shah in 1979, they feel wounded and they want revenge. That's basically the point. So that makes it very, very difficult.
Peyman, thank you so much for this extraordinary class of history on Iran and on the situation nowadays, and for visiting us in Portugal.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for being
Thank you all.
here. Thank you.
E eu aproveito para também comunicar-vos que nas próximas conversas com História vão realizar-se no final de março, em maio, em junho, em setembro e outubro, com uma vastíssima gama de convidados extraordinários, como tivemos hoje o professor Peyman Jafari, e, portanto, estão muito bem-vindos a conhecer o programa e a regressar. Obrigada a todos.